The Ice Age was once a world of giants. Woolly mammoths crossed frozen grasslands. Giant ground sloths moved through ancient forests. Saber-toothed cats waited in the shadows, built for a world that no longer exists. These animals were not myths. They were real, powerful, and widespread. Yet by the end of the Ice Age, many of them were gone. Not all at once, not in one simple disaster. Their disappearance was slower, colder, and harder to explain. Climate changed. Landscapes shifted. Humans arrived in new places. And somewhere between these forces, the great beasts began to fade. So what really happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age? Long before the quiet world we know today, the Ice Age held a different kind of Earth. It was not a planet of endless white ice, as it is sometimes imagined. Much of the land was open, cold, dry and wide. Across northern regions, great plains stretched beneath pale skies. Winds moved over grasses, sedges, low shrubs, frozen soil and river valleys carved by older waters. In some places, huge ice sheets covered the ground for ages. In other places, life continued beside them, not in softness, but in patience. This was a world where distance mattered. Food was not gathered in one easy place. Warmth was not freely given. Every living creature had to meet the cold with a body, a habit, a movement, or a way of staying alive. For the giant beasts of the Ice Age, this world was not a mistake. It was the world that shaped them. The woolly mammoth did not simply walk through this landscape like a visitor. Its thick coat, deep fat, large body, and grazing life belonged to the cold grasslands. Its steps pressed into soil that might stay frozen beneath the surface. Its tusks moved snow, bark, or vegetation in ways that helped it reach what the season allowed. Around it, other large animals also lived by the rhythm of open ground. Ancient bison moved in herds. Horses crossed exposed plains. Woolly rhinoceroses fed in cold steppe environments. In some regions, musk oxen and reindeer endured the hard seasons in their own ways. The Ice Age was not empty. It was crowded with lives that had learned how to survive where comfort was rare. To understand what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, we first have to see that they were not strange accidents placed into a hostile world. They were part of a living system. Their size, their movement, their feeding, and even the space they needed were tied to the land beneath them. A mammoth needed more than a body. It needed open country. It needed enough low-growing plants over enough seasons. It needed roots between feeding grounds, water, shelter, and safer places to raise young. A giant animal carries its world inside its needs. When that world is stable enough, the animal can seem almost unstoppable. But when the foundation begins to shift, even a powerful body becomes dependent on things it cannot control. The Ice Age plains were also shaped by absence. There were no modern roads, no fields cut into squares, no towns shining at night. The ground was marked instead by hooves, paws, claws, tusks, tracks, dung, nests, bones, and the slow pressure of weather. Large herbivores did not merely live on the land. They changed it by feeding, trampling, moving seeds, breaking shrubs, and keeping some areas open. Their presence helped create the look and feel of the country around them. A herd crossing a frozen valley was not just passing through scenery, it was part of the scenery's life. In this sense, the giant beasts of the Ice Age were not separate from the Ice Age. They were one of the ways the Ice Age expressed itself. Their bodies made sense under a cold sky. Their slow migrations made sense across great distances. Their strength made sense in a world where seasons could punish weakness quietly, without drama. Yet this is also where the deeper question begins. If the great beasts were so fitted to their world, then their disappearance cannot be understood by calling them simple failures. They were not weak creatures waiting for extinction. They were successful for long stretches of time, across wide regions, under conditions that would feel severe to most animals alive today. So the story must begin with respect. Before asking why they vanished, we have to remember that they once belonged here completely. The Ice Age was not only a time of cold, it was a world built large enough for giants. The giant beasts of the Ice Age were not all the same kind of animal, and they did not all live in one place like characters gathered into a single scene. They belonged to different lands, different climates, and different food webs. Some lived in the cold open spaces of the north. Some moved through forests, wetlands, or warmer grasslands. Some were plant eaters, carrying huge bodies across the land in search of enough food. Others were predators, shaped by the presence of large prey. Together, they formed what we now call Ice Age megafauna, the large animals whose bones, teeth, tusks, claws and tracks still help us imagine a world that ended before written memory began. The woolly mammoth is often the first animal people picture. It stood with a high shoulder, curved tusks, a thick coat, and a body suited for cold environments. But it was not alone. In North America, mastodons lived too, related to elephants but adapted in different ways, often associated with more wooded environments than the open steppe mammoth. Farther across northern landscapes, the woolly rhinoceros carried a heavy body and horns through cold grasslands. Ancient horses and bison moved in herds, not always as gigantic as mammoths, but still part of the same broad Ice Age world that supported large grazing animals. These herbivores were not background creatures. They were the weight of the landscape made visible. They ate, walked, trampled, migrated, and shaped the ground beneath them. If we ask what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, we first have to know that many of them were not rare oddities. In their own times and places, some were ordinary members of a living world. There were also giants that seem stranger to modern eyes, because nothing quite like them remains at the same scale today. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and some species grew far larger than any living sloth. They were not the small, slow animals hanging from trees that people know now. Many were ground-dwelling, powerful, heavy animals with strong limbs and large claws, adapted for feeding in ways that could include leaves, branches, and low vegetation depending on the species and environment. Their size reminds us that the Ice Age was not only a story of cold, it was also a story of open habitats, forests, edges, and changing plant communities that could support very large bodies. In South America, North America, and other regions, different kinds of large mammals filled different roles. Some browsed, some grazed, some moved between both. The word giant can make them sound simple, but each animal was a careful biological answer to its own world. The predators were part of that answer too. Saber-toothed cats, including Smilodon in the Americas, are remembered for their long upper canine teeth, but those teeth did not make them monsters. They were specialized predators living among large herbivores. Dire wolves hunted in packs in parts of the Americas. Cave lions lived across parts of Eurasia and beyond. Short-faced bears, in North America, were among the large carnivores and omnivores of that age. These animals depended on the same living structure as the herbivores they hunted or scavenged from. A predator's body is tied to the bodies around it. Its strength depends on prey, territory, seasons, and the balance of the land. So when we look at the Ice Age giants, we are not looking at isolated animals waiting to disappear one by one. We are looking at relationships, mammoths and grasslands, sloths and vegetation, rhinoceroses and cold steppe, saber-toothed cats and large prey, bears and broad territories. Each name points to a web of needs. This matters because the disappearance of the giant beasts was not just the loss of impressive bodies, it was the weakening of a whole pattern of life. But at this early point in the story, we should not rush toward an answer. For a long time, these animals lived successfully. Their bones are not just signs of death, they are evidence that they once endured. They crossed winters, droughts, births, injuries, migrations, and generations. They were real animals, not symbols, not decorations in a prehistoric painting. Before we can understand why so many vanished, we need to let them stand for a moment in the world where they belonged. If these giant beasts had been weak, their disappearance would be easier to understand. We could imagine them as animals already failing, unable to survive the cold, unable to find food, unable to compete with the world around them. But that is not what the evidence suggests. For thousands of years, many of them lived successfully in harsh conditions. They endured long winters, dry winds, dangerous births, broken bones, hungry seasons, and the constant pressure of predators and hunger. They were not fragile mistakes. They were survivors of an ancient world. This is why the question at the center of the Ice Age giants is so quiet and so difficult. What happens when an animal is well made for a world that begins to change around it? A woolly mammoth did not need the world to be gentle. It needed the world to be familiar enough. It needed open spaces where cold-adapted grasses and herbs could grow. It needed paths across the land that herds could still follow. It needed young calves to survive long enough to replace the old. A giant ground sloth did not need to be fast like a deer or hidden like a mouse. It needed enough vegetation, enough room, and enough time for its slow life to continue. A saber-toothed cat did not need to rule every landscape. It needed prey large enough, common enough, and predictable enough to support a specialized hunter. Each of these animals was strong, but each strength was tied to a set of conditions. When those conditions held, the giants could last. When those conditions began to loosen, strength alone may not have been enough. This is one of the cold truths behind the question, what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age? Extinction does not always begin with a sudden image. It may begin with fewer young surviving. It may begin with herds moving farther for the same amount of food. It may begin with forests spreading into places that once held open grassland, or with wet ground replacing dry steppe, or with seasonal patterns becoming harder for old migrations to follow. It may begin so slowly that no single animal knows the story it is living inside. One mammoth still finds grass, one sloth still reaches leaves, one predator still makes a kill. But over generations the pattern changes. The old world becomes smaller, not in a single day, but in pieces. The Ice Age was not a frozen stage that stayed still until the animals vanished. It was a moving climate system, with cold periods, warmer intervals, shifting ice, changing plants, rising and falling water, and landscapes that could be remade over long time. The giants had survived change before, but the end of the last Ice Age brought changes that reached across many regions. At the same time, humans were also spreading into new lands, hunting some animals, using fire, crossing routes, and becoming another presence inside ecosystems that were already under pressure. This does not mean every extinction happened for the same reason. It does not mean every animal vanished in the same place, at the same speed, or under the same force. Some populations disappeared earlier. Some lasted longer. Some survived in isolated places after their relatives were gone from the mainland. The story is not clean enough for one simple answer. That is why we have to move carefully. The giant beasts of the Ice Age were not defeated by one idea. They stood at the meeting point of body size, food, climate, reproduction, migration, landscape, predators, and human presence. Their disappearance was not only a biological event, it was a change in the shape of the living world. To ask what happened to them is really to ask how a world that once made room for giants slowly became a world where many of them could no longer remain. And before we look at the forces that pressed against them, we should hold on to this first understanding. They vanished not because they never belonged, but because the world to which they belonged began to move away from them. To understand why the giant beasts of the Ice Age once flourished, we have to begin with something very simple. A large body is not only a large body. In a cold world, it can be a shelter made of flesh, bone, fat, and breath. Small animals lose heat quickly because more of their body is exposed to the air compared with the warmth they carry inside. Large animals, by comparison, can hold warmth more slowly and steadily. This does not mean that size alone could save them from every winter. It means that, in the cold open landscapes of the Ice Age, being large could help an animal endure long nights, hard winds, and seasons when food was spread thinly across the land. A woolly mammoth standing on a frozen plain was not just impressive because it was tall. Its size helped it keep heat. Its fat stored energy. Its thick coat reduced the bite of cold air. Its body turned the difficulties of the Ice Age into something it could live with, day after day, generation after generation. This is one reason the giant beasts should not be imagined as creatures out of place. In many Ice Age environments, large bodies made sense. A big herbivore could walk far across open country. It could lower its head and feed for long hours on grasses, sedges, herbs, bark, or leaves, depending on the animal and the landscape. It could carry energy inside itself when food was not rich in one single place. A mammoth herd could move across great distances because the land itself demanded movement. A woolly rhinoceros, heavy and strong, could live in cold steppe environments where smaller, softer bodies might have struggled with exposure. Large size also offered a kind of protection, not perfect safety, because no animal is completely safe, but a serious advantage. A fully grown mammoth was not easy prey. A giant ground sloth, with strong limbs and long claws, was not defenseless. A large bison or ancient horse could rely on strength, speed, herd movement, or alertness. Predators existed, and they mattered, but the relationship between predator and prey was shaped by size. To attack a large animal required risk, energy, timing, and often cooperation or specialization. In this way, body size helped build the balance of the Ice Age world. The giants were not merely surviving the landscape, they were helping define what survival meant there. Their size affected where they could go, how much food they needed, how much danger they could resist, and how they shaped the ground beneath their feet. Yet size was useful in more than one way. A large animal could influence the land around it simply by living. When a herd of big grazers moved through open country, they pressed snow, broke stems, disturbed soil, and kept vegetation low in places. When they fed, they changed which plants had room to grow. When they moved, they carried nutrients and sometimes seeds across distance. Their bodies became part of the landscape's pattern. This is important for the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because it reminds us that they were not passive victims waiting for the end. They were active members of the world that supported them. Their size helped them endure the cold, use wide spaces, defend themselves, and shape the habitats they depended on. For a long time, this arrangement could hold. The cold grasslands gave food. The animals gave movement and pressure back to the grasslands. Predators followed prey. Herds followed seasons. Bones grew, calves were born, old animals died, and the system continued. A giant body, in that world, was a powerful answer. But every answer depends on the question being asked. During the Ice Age, the question was how to live in open, cold, demanding landscapes where distance, exposure, and seasonal hunger were constant facts. For many giant beasts, the answer was to be large, strong, slow to lose heat, able to travel, and hard to bring down. That answer worked for a very long time. Before we ask why it stopped working, we should recognize how deeply it once belonged to the world that made it possible. Each giant beast of the Ice Age was a different answer to the same old problem: how to live where the world demanded more than ordinary strength. The woolly mammoth answered with warmth, memory, movement, and a body made for open cold. Its thick hair, insulating fat, compact ears, and massive frame helped it hold heat in places where wind could move across the land without trees to stop it. But its body was not only built against cold, it was also built for feeding across wide country. Its teeth were suited for grinding tough vegetation. Its trunk and tusks helped it reach, clear, pull, and handle food in difficult seasons. A mammoth was not simply a large elephant with fur. It was a living arrangement between climate, grassland, season, and herd life. When we ask what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, this matters deeply, because extinction does not happen to a body alone. It happens to the body and the world that body requires. The woolly rhinoceros gave a different answer. It was not shaped like a mammoth. and it did not live in exactly the same way, but it also belonged to cold open environments. Its heavy body, strong neck, and grazing habits made sense in steppe-like landscapes where low vegetation could feed a large animal over time. Ancient bison and horses carried another kind of answer. They were not all enormous in the same dramatic way, but they were part of a world where herds could travel, graze, and follow the changing face of the land. Their power was not only in size, but in number, alertness, and movement. A herd is a kind of memory spread across many bodies. It remembers where food has been found before. It follows routes shaped by generations. It makes the open land feel alive, not empty. Giant ground sloths answered the Ice Age world in a slower, heavier voice. Some were immense, ground-dwelling animals with strong limbs and large claws. They were not quick creatures made for sudden escape. Their lives were built around strength, reach, feeding, and endurance. In wooded edges, open areas, or mixed habitats, depending on the species, a large ground sloth could use its body to pull branches, browse vegetation, and occupy a role no living sloth fills today. It reminds us that the Ice Age was never only one landscape. It had cold plains, forests, wetlands, drylands, and shifting borders between them. The giant beasts were shaped by these differences. They were not all trying to survive in the same way. This is why the story cannot be reduced to a single image of snow and mammoths. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants would later involve many habitats, many diets, and many weaknesses that appeared only when conditions changed. Predators gave still another answer. A saber-toothed cat did not need the body of a mammoth. It needed a body designed for its own kind of risk. Its powerful forelimbs, heavy build, and long canine teeth suggest a predator specialized for handling large prey in ways very different from the hunting style of many modern big cats. It lived in a world where large herbivores were part of the food base. Dire wolves, cave lions, and large bears also belong to food webs, where size and strength move through every level. A predator's adaptation is never independent. It is written partly in the bodies of the animals it follows. If the prey change, the predator's world changes too. This is one of the quiet links at the center of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age. The plant eaters were tied to vegetation and climate. The hunters were tied to the plant eaters. The landscape was tied to the feet, teeth, dung, and movement of the animals that used it. Each creature seemed complete when seen alone, but none of them was alone in the deeper sense. A mammoth's coat answered the cold. A rhinoceros's mouth answered the steppe. A sloth's claws answered vegetation. A saber-toothed cat's body answered large prey. These answers worked because the question stayed familiar for a long time. The land still offered the right food. The seasons still allowed enough young to survive. The routes still connected one place to another. The balance did not have to be perfect. Nature rarely is. It only had to be steady enough for life to continue. But when the ancient question began to change, each answer would be tested. And the more specialized the answer was, the more deeply it depended on the world remaining close to what it had been. The same body that once protected an Ice Age giant could later become the body that made survival harder. This is not because size was a mistake. For a long time, size was one of the great answers to the cold world. A mammoth's mass helped it keep warmth. A woolly rhinoceros could stand against wind and distance. A giant ground sloth could rely on strength and reach rather than speed. A saber-toothed cat could specialize in powerful prey because the world around it still held enough large animals to make that way of life possible. But every advantage has a quiet condition hidden inside it. A large body needs more food. A long life often means slower reproduction. A specialized predator needs a dependable kind of prey. A herd that moves across open land needs the land to remain open enough. When the Ice Age world began to shift, these hidden conditions became more important. The giants did not suddenly become poorly made. Their old strength simply belonged to an older question. If cold open grasslands shrink, a body built for feeding across those grasslands must work harder. If vegetation changes from low, open plants to denser shrubs, forests, or wetter ground in some regions, animals adapted to steppe-like feeding may find less of what their bodies were designed to use. If herds become smaller, predators that once depended on large prey may travel farther, spend more energy, and raise fewer young. Nothing in this process needs to look dramatic from one day to the next. The danger can be slow. One season is slightly poorer, one migration becomes less reliable. One group of animals finds itself separated from another. One calf is born into a world with less food than its mother once knew. Over many generations, the old advantage begins to thin. This is one of the most important ideas in the story of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age. Survival is not only about strength, it is about fit. A creature survives when its body, its behavior, its food, its enemies, its young, and its landscape still fit together well enough. During much of the Ice Age, the great beasts fit their world with remarkable success. Their bodies were large because largeness could answer cold, distance, danger, and scattered food. Their slow lives were possible because the environment still gave them enough time. Their migrations were possible because routes still connected, feeding places. Their predators were possible because large prey still moved through the land. But when several parts of that fit begin to loosen at once, even a powerful animal may be pressed from more than one side. A mammoth may still be strong, but strength cannot create a vanished grassland. A giant sloth may still have claws and muscle, but claws do not stop a habitat from changing. A saber-toothed cat may still have its teeth, but teeth do not matter in the same way if the prey base becomes smaller or less predictable. This does not mean the giants were doomed from the beginning. It means their success depended on relationships that could be disturbed. The Ice Age giants were not separate machines. They were living beings inside systems of climate, plants, water, soil, prey, predators, and later, human presence. When one part moved, other parts felt it. When many parts moved together, the pressure could become deep and lasting. So the question is not simply why the giant beasts were not strong enough. That question is too small. A better question is why the world that once rewarded their strength began to reward other kinds of bodies, other kinds of movement, and other ways of surviving. Smaller animals could often reproduce faster. More flexible feeders could sometimes shift more easily. Species that needed less land or less food could pass through hard times with less pressure on each generation. The giants, by contrast, carried the cost of being giant. Their bodies needed abundance spread across space. Their young needed time. Their populations needed enough adults to remain connected. What had once made them majestic also made them vulnerable when the ancient pattern changed. In that sense, the Ice Age giants did not vanish because size failed by itself. They began to lose their place when the world around their size no longer held steady. The Ice Age can sound like one long season of cold, as if the whole earth simply froze and waited until the giant animals were gone. But the real story was slower, older, and more uneven than that. The Ice Age was not a single frozen moment. It was a long period shaped by repeated changes in climate, with colder phases, warmer intervals, growing ice, shrinking ice, dry winds, shifting rain, exposed land, and changing seas. Ice sheets could spread across great parts of the north, then later retreat. Glaciers could lock water into land ice, lowering sea levels and exposing new routes. Later, when warming returned, meltwater could flow, seas could rise, and old paths could disappear. To a human life, these changes may seem too slow to notice, but to herds, forests, grasslands, rivers, and generations of animals, they were powerful enough to remake the world. This matters for the giant beasts of the Ice Age because they did not live inside a still picture. They lived inside a moving system. A mammoth herd crossing a cold grassland was not walking through a permanent stage. It was moving across a landscape that had been different before and would become different again. The cold itself changed in intensity. Sometimes were harsher, drier, and more open. Other times allowed more moisture, more shrubs, or more forest in certain regions. The border between ice, tundra, steppe, woodland, and wet ground was never fixed forever. Animals could follow these borders for a while. Plants could spread into new areas when conditions allowed. Herds could shift their routes as food moved across the land. Predators could follow the herbivores. For a long time, life adjusted. The giants were not helpless in the face of ordinary change. Their history shows that many of them had already survived earlier swings in climate. They had lived through cold phases and warmer phases before the final great changes at the end of the last ice age. This is why their disappearance cannot be explained by simply saying, "the climate changed," as if that phrase were enough. Climate had always changed. The deeper question is what kind of change came, how fast it came in different places, what it did to food and habitat, and whether large animals could still keep their old patterns alive. A woolly mammoth did not need every place to remain cold. It needed enough of the right open habitat across enough land. A woolly rhinoceros did not need the world to stop changing entirely. It needed the plants and spaces that its body could use. A giant ground sloth did not need one perfect forest or one perfect plain. It needed a landscape where its feeding life could continue across generations. When climate shifts changed the ground slowly, some animals could move with the change. But movement has limits. Ice, mountains, rivers, forests, wetlands, deserts, and later human presence could all shape where an animal could go. A changing climate is not only a change in temperature, it is a change in distance, food, timing, and possibility. If spring plants appear earlier or in different places, if open grassland shrinks, if snow cover changes, if water moves differently across the ground, then the old relationship between body and land is altered. The giant beasts of the Ice Age depended on that relationship. Their strength had meaning only when the land still offered the conditions that strength could use. A large body could endure cold, but it could not eat ice. It could cross distance, but not if the right feeding grounds became too scattered or broken. It could survive a hard year, but repeated poor years could press against reproduction and young survival. So the Ice Age should be imagined not as a silent white wall, but as a breathing landscape, expanding and contracting over long time. Its cold phases opened certain worlds, its warmer phases closed some of them and opened others. The animals lived inside those changes until, in many places, the balance began to turn against them. Not suddenly, not everywhere in the same way, and not with one simple cause. The first step is only to understand that the world of the giants was never completely still. The ground beneath their story was always moving. When the Ice Age climate shifted, the change did not arrive only as warmer air or colder air. It arrived through the ground. It arrived through plants, rivers, snow, mud, open plains, forests, and the paths animals had followed for generations. A few degrees of warming, spread over centuries or millennia, could change what grew on a hillside. A change in moisture could decide whether a place stayed dry and grassy, or slowly became covered with shrubs, bogs, or trees. A retreating glacier could leave behind raw ground, lakes, meltwater channels, and new valleys. A rising sea could cover a land bridge that animals once crossed. These were not small details to the giant beasts of the Ice Age. They were the map of life itself. A mammoth did not live from temperature alone. It lived from the plants that temperature and moisture allowed. A woolly rhinoceros did not feed on the idea of cold. It fed on real vegetation, growing in real places, under real seasons. A saber-toothed cat did not hunt an abstract climate. It followed prey that depended on grass, water, shelter, and movement. When the land changed, every animal had to meet that change through its body. Some landscapes that had once been open could become more closed. Grasses and herbs could give way to shrubs or young forest in certain regions. In other places, wet ground could spread where dry steppe had once supported grazing animals. The edge of ice could move northward or upward. Rivers could shift course as meltwater changed the shape of valleys. Lakes could form, drain, or expand. A herd that once moved across a familiar open route might find the route broken by water, woodland, rough ground, or simply by the loss of reliable food along the way. This is how climate becomes more than climate. It becomes a series of choices that the animal did not choose. Move farther, stay, and eat less. Split into smaller groups, follow a new valley, return to an old place and find it changed. For a large animal, each choice carried weight. More movement meant more energy. Less food meant weaker bodies. Smaller groups meant fewer mates and fewer young. The giant beasts of the Ice Age were not helpless, but they were tied to scale. Their lives needed room. Their feeding grounds had to be broad enough. Their migration paths had to remain connected enough. When the map became patchier, life could become harder without becoming impossible all at once. That slow pressure is important. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants was not always like a door closing in a single moment. In many places, it may have been more like a room growing smaller while the animal inside was still alive. One valley still held grass. Another no longer did. One herd still found a seasonal path. Another path ended near forest, water, or bare ground. One generation still survived. The next survived with more difficulty. In this way, changing landscapes could weaken the bond between the giants and the world that had made them successful. The same process affected predators, though in a different form. A large cat, wolf, or bear might not care directly whether grasses changed into shrubs, but it would care when herds changed their routes, when large prey became less common, or when young, old, or weakened animals appeared in different numbers. Predators live from the movement of life below them in the food web. If herbivores spread out, decline, or move into new patterns, the hunters must also adjust. Some could shift. Some could follow different prey, but specialized bodies carry specialized needs. The more a predator depended on large animals, the more it was tied to the fate of those animals. This is why the story of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age cannot be told only by naming extinct species. We have to watch the land beneath them. We have to see grasslands narrowing, forests spreading in some regions, wet areas replacing dry ones, ice retreating, rivers changing, and routes becoming less dependable. The giants were walking through a world whose shape was slowly being redrawn. They may not have known the old map was disappearing, but their bodies, their hunger, their calves, and their movements would have felt the change long before anything looked final. For the giant beasts of the Ice Age, a changing landscape was never just scenery changing around them. It was food changing. It was distance changing. It was the old rhythm of survival becoming less dependable. A mammoth herd did not need a perfect world, but it did need enough open ground where the right plants could grow. It needed places where adults could feed for long hours, and calves could keep pace beside their mothers. It needed seasonal routes that still made sense, not only for 1 year, but across many generations. When cold grasslands became smaller in some regions, or more broken by shrubs, forest, wet ground, lakes, or changing rivers, the herd had to answer with movement. It might travel farther for the same amount of food. It might return to a place that no longer offered what it once had. It might split into smaller groups, each searching for a patch of land still familiar enough to support them. None of this would look like a sudden ending. From the outside, the animals would still appear powerful. A mammoth would still be tall. A rhinoceros would still carry its weight. A giant sloth would still pull vegetation with strength. But inside the pattern of life, the cost would rise. More walking means more energy spent before food is found. Poorer food means weaker bodies, slower growth, and young animals less able to survive hard seasons. Smaller ranges mean fewer chances for groups to meet, breed, and keep their numbers strong. This is why the end of the Ice Age becomes so important to the question of what happened to the giant beasts. They were not simply standing in the way of warming air. They were living inside a map that was being redrawn. The plants moved, the water moved, the ice retreated, the open spaces changed shape, and the animals had to follow, adjust, or lose ground. Some species could change their diets more easily than others. Some could live in mixed habitats. Some could move into new areas if the path remained open. But large animals often carry large needs. A small animal may survive in a pocket of shelter, eating seeds, insects, roots, or many different foods. A giant grazer or browser needs much more. It needs quantity. It needs access. It needs repeated success, season after season. A few difficult years may not destroy a species, but repeated pressure can lower numbers quietly. The danger is not always starvation in one dramatic winter. Sometimes the danger is that fewer young are born, fewer young survive, and fewer adults remain to hold the old range together. Predators would feel this same change from another direction. If large herbivores became rarer or more scattered, hunters that depended on them had to search farther too. A saber-toothed cat could not simply command prey to remain abundant. A cave lion could not keep herds in old valleys once the valleys changed. A dire wolf could follow, adapt, or compete, but it too depended on the living movement of the herbivores beneath it in the food web. When the plant world shifted, the herbivore world shifted. When the herbivore world shifted, the predator world shifted. The whole Ice Age community was tied together by needs that were simple and deep: food, space, water, shelter, reproduction, and time. This does not mean climate alone explains every disappearance. It does not mean every species failed for the same reason. The timing was different in different regions, and the pressures were not identical everywhere. But the movement of climate and habitat gave the background against which every other pressure became more serious. A hunted population is more vulnerable if it is already stressed. A slow-breeding animal is more vulnerable if food becomes patchy. A predator is more vulnerable if prey becomes unpredictable. The Ice Age giants were strong, but they were not free from the land. Their bodies were agreements with a particular kind of world. When that world changed, the agreement became harder to keep. So, before we speak of humans, hunting, or final extinction, we have to stay for a moment with this quieter truth. Many giant beasts first faced a world where the places that fed them, guided them, and held them together were no longer as wide, as connected, or as reliable as before. One of the most important places in the story of the Ice Age giants was not a cave, not a glacier, and not a frozen wasteland. It was a vast kind of open country now often called the Mammoth Steppe. The name can be misleading if we imagine only mammoths walking through snow. This world was colder than many landscapes today, and often dry, but it was also alive with low plants. It held grasses, sedges, herbs, small shrubs, and seasonal growth that could feed large animals across wide distances. It was not soft country. It was exposed to wind, frost, and long winters. But it was not empty. In many northern regions during cold periods of the Pleistocene, this open steppe tundra environment stretched across enormous areas of Eurasia and Beringia, linking lands that are now separated or covered by different ecosystems. To the giant beasts of the Ice Age, this was not just habitat, it was the floor beneath their entire way of life. A woolly mammoth needed more than cold air. It needed the kind of open ground where low vegetation could grow in enough quantity. A woolly rhinoceros needed broad spaces where grazing could support a heavy body. Horses and steppe bison needed room to move in herds. Reindeer, musk oxen, and other cold-adapted animals also used parts of this world in different ways. The mammoth steppe was not a single flat carpet covering the earth without variation. It had river valleys, patches of shrub, drier ridges, wetter hollows, exposed soils, and seasonal differences. But across its broad pattern, it offered something very important: space and food together. For large herbivores, those two things must meet. Food without space may not be enough for herds. Space without food is only distance. The mammoth steppe gave many Ice Age giants a world large enough for their bodies and active enough for their hunger. This is why its fading matters so much to the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age. When people imagine extinction, they often picture the last animal falling. But before a last animal exists, there is usually a last strong landscape, a last wide range, a last set of roots that still works. The mammoth steppe was one of those foundations. It helped hold together entire communities of large herbivores, and those herbivores in turn helped hold parts of the landscape open through grazing, trampling, and movement. Their presence affected plants. Their dung returned nutrients. Their feet disturbed snow and soil. Their feeding could limit some shrubs and keep some areas more open. The animals and the land were tied together in a long conversation. The land fed the giants, and the giants helped shape the land that fed them. This does not mean the mammoth steppe was created by the animals alone. Climate, soil, moisture, temperature, and season all mattered deeply. But it does mean the ecosystem was a relationship, not a background. As the last ice age moved toward its end, many places became warmer, and in some regions, wetter. The balance between grasses, herbs, shrubs, trees, snow cover, and wet ground began to change. The old open country did not disappear everywhere at the same moment. It faded unevenly. Some areas remained suitable longer, some became patchy, some shifted toward tundra, forest, bog, or mixed landscapes that no longer supported the same density of large grazers. For a mammoth herd, this change would not appear as a theory. It would appear as fewer feeding places along an old route. For a rhinoceros, it might appear as poorer grazing ground. For predators, it would appear later, as prey became less abundant or less predictable. The fading of the mammoth steppe was therefore not simply a change in scenery. It was a weakening of the great stage on which many Ice Age giants had learned to live. The mammoth steppe mattered because it did not support only one famous animal. It supported a whole way of living. When we speak of woolly mammoths, it is easy to picture one great body moving through snow, alone under a grey sky. But mammoths were herd animals, and a herd needs more than a dramatic landscape. It needs repeated feeding grounds, open routes, water, seasonal movement, and enough plant growth to support mothers, calves, young males, old females, and the slow rhythm of generations. The mammoth steppe gave many of these things at once. It was cold, but it was often dry and open. It could hold grasses and flowering herbs that were more nutritious than a simple image of frozen tundra suggests. For mammoths, this meant the land could offer food across broad spaces, not always easily, and not always in abundance, but often enough for a large grazing life to continue. For horses, the open country allowed movement and herd behavior. For steppe bison, it offered grazing and distance. For woolly rhinoceroses, it gave the kind of low vegetation and exposed ground that could support a heavy, cold-adapted animal. These animals were different from one another, but they were tied to the same broad pattern, a landscape where openness, cold, dryness, and seasonal plant growth met in a way that large herbivores could use. This is why the mammoth steppe was more than a place where Ice Age giants happened to stand. It was one of the deep reasons they could exist at such scale. Large animals need large answers from the land. A small animal may survive on scattered seeds, hidden roots, insects, or narrow shelters. A mammoth could not live that way. A woolly rhinoceros could not shrink its hunger to fit a tiny patch of food. A herd of horses could not keep its old life if open ground broke into small, disconnected pieces. The mammoth steppe was valuable because it joined food with movement. It allowed animals to travel from one feeding area to another without always passing through dense forest or deep wetland. It gave predators a world where large prey could be found. It gave scavengers bones, hides, and remains. It gave plants the pressure of grazing and trampling. It gave the whole system a shape. To ask what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age is partly to ask what happened to this shape, because when the shape of the land changed, the bodies that depended on it had to change their lives as well. A mammoth's tusks, teeth, coat, and size made sense on open, cold ground. A woolly rhinoceros made sense where low plants were reachable across wide country. Ancient horses and bison made sense where herds could keep moving. Even predators made sense, only because the herbivore world beneath them was large enough to feed danger itself. The mammoth steppe was therefore a foundation, not a decoration. It was like a quiet agreement between climate, soil, plants and animals. The cold helped limit dense forests in many places. The dryness helped keep wide areas open. The plants fed the herbivores. The herbivores disturbed the plants and soil, returning nutrients and helping maintain open patches. Predators followed the herbivores. The dead fed scavengers. Nothing in this agreement was perfectly stable, but for long periods it was stable enough. Stable enough is often all life needs, not perfection, not safety, only enough repetition for young animals to grow, adults to breed, herds to remember roots, and populations to continue. This makes the later fading of the mammoth steppe especially important. If a famous animal disappears, we may first look at the animal itself. We may ask whether mammoths were hunted, whether rhinoceroses were too slow to adapt, whether giant predators lost their prey. But beneath all those questions is the quieter one. What happened to the land that made their lives possible? If the open steppe became smaller, wetter, more wooded, or more broken in some regions, the animals did not simply lose scenery. They lost the arrangement that allowed their bodies to make sense. The mammoth steppe helped build the giants by feeding them, spacing them, guiding them, and connecting them. When that living foundation weakened, the Ice Age giants were not immediately gone, but the world that had once carried them began to carry them less easily. When the mammoth steppe began to fade, the change did not mean that every open plain vanished in one season, or that every giant animal suddenly found itself without food. The fading was slower and more uneven than that. Some regions may have remained open for a long time. Some still held grasses, herbs, and cold-adapted plants in scattered patches. Some herds could continue for many generations after the first signs of change. But the old world was no longer as wide, as connected, or as dependable as it had been. In many places, as the climate became warmer, and in some regions, wetter after the last glacial maximum, plant communities shifted. Shrubs could spread where low open vegetation once dominated. Forests could move into areas that had once been more open. Wet tundra, boggy ground, or mixed landscapes could replace the drier steppe conditions that had supported large grazing animals so well. This was not simply a change in colour, from brown grass to green trees. It was a change in what the land could feed. For a mammoth, a wetter or more wooded landscape might still contain plants, but not always the right kind, not always in the right amount, and not always across the distances a herd needed. For a woolly rhinoceros, the loss of broad, open grazing ground could mean more time spent searching and less time gaining energy. For horses and bison, broken open country could make herd movement less effective. The problem was not that life disappeared from the land. The problem was that a different kind of life began to replace the world built for giants. This is a quiet but important difference. A forest can be rich with birds, insects, deer, roots, fungi, leaves, and hidden movement. A wetland can be full of life. A warmer landscape can support many living things. But not every living landscape can support the same animals. The giant beasts of the Ice Age were tied to particular arrangements of food, space, season, and movement. If those arrangements changed too far, the animals could not simply decide to become smaller, breed faster, eat less, or live in narrow pockets of land. Their bodies carried the memory of the old steppe. Their teeth, legs, stomachs, migration patterns, and herd structures all made sense in a world that was becoming less common. This is why the fading of the mammoth steppe belongs at the center of the question. What happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age? Before many species disappeared, the world that supported them was already being rearranged. The large herbivores would have felt this first through hunger and movement. A route that once connected feeding grounds might become less useful. A valley once filled with low plants might grow denser with shrubs. A plain that once stayed dry enough for grazing might become wetter and more difficult to cross. A herd might still survive, but it might survive with less strength. Calves might still be born, but fewer might live through hard years. Adults might still travel, but the journey might demand more energy. Predators would feel the change through the bodies of their prey. If mammoths, horses, bison, or other large herbivores became more scattered, The hunters and scavengers of the Ice Age would face a less predictable world too. A saber-toothed cat did not need grass directly, but it needed the animals that grass once fed. A cave lion did not depend on steppe plants with its mouth, but it depended on the prey that did. A whole food web can begin to loosen when the foundation under its largest plant eaters becomes patchy. Still, it is important not to turn this into a single, simple explanation. The mammoth steppe did not vanish everywhere at the same time. The giant beasts did not all respond in the same way. Some species had wider diets. Some regions changed sooner than others. Some animals lasted longer in refuges, isolated pockets, or places where older conditions remained. But the great pattern was clear enough to matter. As the Ice Age ended, many landscapes no longer supported the same broad, cold, dry, open world that had once carried so many large bodies. The giants did not lose because the earth became lifeless. They lost ground because the earth became different. And for animals built so deeply around one kind of world, difference itself could become a slow form of pressure. A large body carries strength, but it also carries a cost. For the giant beasts of the Ice Age, this cost was hidden during the long periods when the land still gave them enough food, space, and time. A mammoth could appear almost unshakable as it moved across open ground, wrapped in hair and fat, walking with the slow confidence of an animal built for cold. A giant ground sloth could seem too strong to be easily threatened. A woolly rhinoceros could carry its heavy body through harsh wind and frozen soil, but beneath that strength was a simple biological truth. Large animals usually need more. They need more food, more room, more time to grow, and often more time between generations. A mouse can live in a small hidden place and replace its numbers quickly. Many insects can rise in number after a good season. Small animals often pass through danger by breeding fast, maturing quickly, and using narrow spaces. The great beasts could not live that way. Their survival depended on a slower rhythm. They needed long childhoods, strong mothers, enough feeding ground for adults, and enough stable years for young animals to reach breeding age. This matters deeply to the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because extinction often begins not with the death of every adult, but with the failure of enough young to replace them. A herd may still look alive. Large bodies may still stand on the horizon. Tracks may still cross snow or mud. But if fewer calves survive, if females are weakened by poor feeding, if groups become too scattered to remain connected, the population can begin to decline quietly. From the outside, there is no dramatic sign at first. The animals are still there. Their tusks still curve, their hooves still press the ground, their predators still follow them. Yet the future becomes thinner. A population is not only the animals that are alive today, it is also the young that will be born, the young that will survive, and the adults that will meet again across the land. Large animals often have less room for error in this hidden future. If a small animal loses many individuals in a hard year, it may recover quickly when conditions improve. But a giant herbivore cannot replace a lost adult in a single season. A calf needs time. A mother needs enough food to carry and raise it. A young animal needs protection, movement, and years before it becomes part of the breeding population. This slow replacement is not weakness in a stable world. It is simply a different way of living. But when climate shifts, food becomes patchy, roots break apart, or humans add new pressure through hunting, the slow rhythm can become dangerous. The body that once helped the animal endure cold now requires a great amount of energy to maintain. The size that once discouraged predators now demands broad feeding grounds. The long life that once helped memory and herd stability now means that recovery is slow when deaths become too frequent. For predators, the same principle appears in another form. Large hunters also need space, prey, and time. A saber-toothed cat or cave lion could not survive on strength alone if large prey became less predictable. A powerful predator raising young in a thinning world would face the same quiet arithmetic. Energy in, energy out, births, deaths, distance, and chance. The Ice Age giants were not fragile because they were large. They were vulnerable because largeness tied them to a wide and demanding set of needs. As long as the old world met those needs, their size was an advantage. But when the world began to change, every need became a point where pressure could enter. More food needed, more land needed, more time needed, slower recovery after loss. This is why the disappearance of the giant beasts should not be imagined only as a sudden fall. It may also be understood as a slow imbalance between what their bodies required and what the changing world could still provide. The difference between a small animal and a giant animal is not only what we see when they stand beside each other, it is also the difference between two clocks. A small mammal may live quickly, it may grow fast, breed early, produce many young, and use narrow corners of the world where danger passes over it. If a hard winter kills many of its kind, a few good seasons may allow numbers to rise again. Not always, and not for every species, but often enough for small bodies to have a kind of flexibility that large bodies do not have. A giant beast lives by a slower clock. A mammoth calf was not born ready to replace an adult. It needed milk, protection, learning, movement with the herd, and years before it could take part in the future of the population. A mother needed enough food to carry that calf, nurse it, and stay strong herself. The herd needed enough adults to protect the young and enough land to feed everyone. When the world was stable enough, this slow clock could work beautifully. It allowed long lives, memory, social learning, and steady movement across open landscapes. But when pressure increased, the same slow clock made recovery difficult. If a population of large animals lost too many adults, it could not simply refill the empty space in 1 or 2 seasons. The lost bodies represented years of growth, years of feeding, years of survival, and years of reproductive possibility. This is why the decline of the Ice Age giants may have been so dangerous even when it looked gradual. Imagine a herd that still appears strong from a distance. There are still large adults. There are still tracks in the mud. There are still calves walking close to their mothers. Nothing seems finished. But perhaps there are fewer calves than before. Perhaps fewer young survive their first winters. Perhaps older females are not replaced quickly enough. Perhaps groups that once met across open country are now separated by forests, wet ground, human activity, or broken feeding routes. The herd remains visible, but its future is quietly shrinking. A small animal population might survive such thinning if it can breed rapidly when conditions improve. A giant population has less room for repeated loss. Each death weighs more because each life took longer to build. The same slow arithmetic applied beyond mammoths. A giant ground sloth did not live by the quick numbers of a rabbit. A woolly rhinoceros did not replace itself like a mouse. Large predators also face slow recovery because raising young required prey, territory, and time. If a saber-toothed cat lost access to enough large prey, its strength did not solve the problem of feeding its young. If cave lions or other large carnivores faced thinner prey populations, their own numbers could decline after the herbivores declined. This connection is important to the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because extinction can move through time before it becomes visible in bones. A population may already be in trouble while animals still walk the land. It is not enough for some individuals to survive. Enough young must survive, enough adults must meet, enough groups must remain connected, enough food must return in enough seasons. The giant beasts carried heavy bodies, but they also carried heavy timelines. Their lives were built over years, not weeks. Their populations recovered slowly, not instantly. When climate changed the food map, when habitats became patchier, when predators and prey were pulled out of old balance, and when humans added new pressure in some regions, the slow clock of large animals could become a trap. It did not make them doomed. It made them less able to absorb repeated shocks. The cold truth is that a species can begin to disappear long before the last animal dies. It begins when the future cannot replace the present. For the Ice Age giants, that future may have become thinner. One calf, one herd, one valley, and one generation at a time. The disappearance of the giant beasts of the Ice Age may have begun long before anyone could have recognized it as disappearance. That is one of the hardest parts of extinction to imagine. We tend to picture an ending as a final scene, the last mammoth standing alone, the last giant sloth moving through a quiet forest, the last saber-toothed cat leaving no descendants behind. But the deeper ending begins earlier, while animals still live, while herds still walk, while predators still hunt, while bones are still growing in young bodies. A species can be present and already losing its future. For the Ice Age giants, this slow danger was tied to the pressure of large bodies and slow recovery. If food became harder to find, a small animal might survive on less, hide in smaller places, or recover quickly when conditions improved. A giant animal had fewer easy escapes. A mammoth could not reduce its needs to match a shrinking patch of grass. A woolly rhinoceros could not quickly become a forest animal if the open steppe changed around it. A giant ground sloth could not breed rapidly to replace losses after repeated hard seasons. A large predator could not remain abundant if large prey became rare. The pressure did not have to destroy every individual at once. It only had to make each generation slightly harder to replace than the one before. This connects directly to what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because their decline may have unfolded through a quiet imbalance between birth and death. If the number of surviving young fell below what the population needed, then the herd could still look alive while becoming less secure. If adults died a little more often, from hunger, injury, hunting, disease, or long travel, and young animals did not replace them quickly enough, the decline could continue beneath the surface. If groups became isolated from one another, the problem could deepen. A small herd might continue for a while in a valley, on a plain, or in a refuge where conditions still seemed acceptable. But if it rarely met other groups, its future became narrower. It had fewer mates, less genetic exchange, less resilience after a hard year, and less ability to rebuild after loss. Extinction is often not a straight road. It is a narrowing of choices. The animal can still eat, but in fewer places. It can still breed, but with fewer partners. It can still migrate, but along routes that are less reliable. It can still survive, but with less margin. For the giants, the margin mattered. Their bodies required space, their young required time, and their populations required enough connection across the land. When the Ice Age environment shifted, these needs became harder to meet. When humans entered some of these landscapes, the same slow arithmetic could become even more fragile. A few additional losses might not matter much to a fast-breeding animal, but for a slow-breeding giant, repeated loss could change the future. This does not mean one hunter, one winter, or one drought explains the disappearance of the Ice Age megafauna. It means that large animals can decline through accumulation. One poor season weakens mothers. One broken route separates herds. One shrinking grassland reduces food. One added source of mortality removes adults that took years to grow. One generation survives with fewer young than before. Then the next generation begins from a smaller place. The world may still contain giants, but not as many, not as widely, not as securely. Their disappearance, then, was not only an event at the end, it was a process, hidden inside ordinary life. The final absence came after many smaller absences, fewer tracks, fewer calves, fewer herds, fewer hunting trails for predators, fewer bones left by animals that once filled the land. The great beasts did not have to become weak in order to vanish. They only had to face a world where their slow, heavy, wide-ranging lives could no longer be renewed fast enough. Humans entered the story of the Ice Age giants not as a single sudden disaster, but as one more pressure arriving in a world that was already changing. This is important to say slowly, because the disappearance of the giant beasts has often been told in a simple way. In one version, climate changed and the animals could not adapt. In another version, humans arrived and hunted them until they were gone. But the real picture is more careful than either sentence alone. Human groups spread into many regions during the later part of the Pleistocene, But they did not arrive everywhere at the same time. The animals did not vanish everywhere at the same time either. Some species disappeared earlier in one region and later in another. Some survived long after others had faded. Some lived in landscapes where climate pressure was strong. Others lived in places where human hunting may have added serious strain. So when we bring humans into the story, we should not imagine a simple line of people walking across the earth and every giant falling behind them. We should imagine small groups of highly skilled foragers entering lands filled with animals, weather, rivers, plants, old migration routes, and dangers that had existed long before any human footprint appeared there. These people were not modern industrial hunters. They did not carry guns, engines, fences, or machines. They lived by close attention to land and season. They followed tracks, understood animal movement, used stone, bone, wood, fire, cooperation, and memory. In some places, they hunted large animals. In some places, they likely took smaller prey, gathered plants, scavenged, fished, or moved with the rhythms of local resources. Their impact depended on number, skill, prey behavior, landscape, and the condition of animal populations before they arrived. This is where the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age becomes especially delicate. A healthy, widespread population of large animals might absorb some hunting. But a population already weakened by changing habitat, reduced food, slower reproduction, or broken migration routes could be far more vulnerable. For a mammoth herd under pressure, the loss of even a few breeding adults could matter more than it once would have. For a slow-breeding animal, repeated losses do not have to be enormous to become serious over generations. Human hunting, where it occurred, may have worked not like a single final blow everywhere, but like an added weight on a structure already carrying too much. A large animal might still stand strong before a spear, but a species is not protected only by the strength of one adult. It is protected by enough adults, enough young, enough food, enough time, and enough connected land. If any of those had already been reduced, human pressure could make recovery harder. Humans also changed landscapes in ways beyond direct hunting, though we have to speak carefully and avoid claiming more than the evidence allows for each region. Fire, movement, repeated use of certain places, and competition for space could have affected local environments. The meaning of human arrival was therefore not the same everywhere. In one valley, it may have meant occasional hunting. In another, it may have meant animals avoiding familiar areas. In another, it may have meant little direct effect. In another, it may have joined with climate stress at exactly the wrong time. The Ice Age giants met humans inside a world of changing plants and shrinking open habitats, not in a world standing still. That is why this part of the story should feel neither like a simple accusation nor like a dismissal. Humans were real participants in late Ice Age ecosystems. They were intelligent, observant, adaptable, and capable of affecting animal populations. But the giant beasts were also facing older forces: climate shifts, habitat change, food pressure, and the biological cost of being large. The question is not whether humans mattered or climate mattered. The deeper question is how these forces met in different places, around different species, at different moments. When humans entered a changing world, they did not create every pressure, but in some places they may have turned pressure into decline, and decline into disappearance. Human pressure did not need to look enormous in order to matter. This is one of the quietest and most difficult parts of the Ice Age story. When we imagine hunting, we may picture a dramatic scene, a group of people facing a mammoth, a spear lifted, a dangerous moment frozen in the mind. But the real pressure on large animals may have been slower and less visible than that. Humans lived by attention. They watched tracks, seasons, herd movement, water sources, sheltering places, and the behavior of animals under stress. A large herbivore could be followed, studied, and approached at vulnerable moments. A sick animal, a young animal, an isolated adult, or a herd passing through a narrow route could become more exposed. Even if hunting was occasional rather than constant, it could still matter when the animals being hunted reproduce slowly. For a fast-breeding species, scattered losses may disappear into the next generation. For a mammoth, a giant sloth, a mastodon, or a woolly rhinoceros, every adult represented many years of growth. Every breeding female represented future calves that might never be born. Every lost young animal represented time the population could not easily recover. This does not mean humans alone caused all the disappearances of the giant beasts of the Ice Age. It means human activity may have added pressure to populations already living inside a changing world. Hunting was only one possible form of that pressure. Humans also moved through landscapes, used camps, followed rivers, crossed valleys, gathered fuel, and sometimes used fire. Fire could alter local vegetation, open some areas, disturb others, and change how animals moved through familiar ground. We should not imagine the whole Ice Age landscape burning because humans arrived. That would be too simple. But in certain places, repeated human use of fire could have influenced local patterns of plant growth, animal movement, and access to shelter or feeding areas. A herd that had already lost some open grassland to climate-driven change might become more sensitive to any additional disturbance. A predator already following fewer large herbivores might suffer if prey avoided certain routes. A giant animal did not need to be hunted every day to feel the presence of humans. It only needed enough disturbance, enough risk, or enough added mortality to make an already narrow future narrower. Space also mattered. The giant beasts of the Ice Age often needed broad ranges and connected paths. Humans, though small in number compared with later societies, were flexible and intelligent. They could use river crossings, high ground, caves, rock shelters, water edges, and animal trails. These were often the same kinds of places that animals also used because the land itself guided movement there. In a wide open world, the overlap might seem minor, but when habitats became patchier, overlap could become more important. If the best feeding areas, safest crossings, or seasonal routes were fewer than before, then every shared place mattered more. Human presence could change where animals felt safe, where they gathered, and how they moved. Again, this was not the same everywhere. Some animals may have had little contact with people for long periods. Others may have encountered humans repeatedly in the wrong places at the wrong time. The important point is not to turn humans into a single simple answer, but to understand how human pressure could combine with slow biological vulnerability. Large animals needed time to recover. Climate change reduced or rearranged some habitats. Food became less predictable in many regions. Herds could become smaller or more isolated. Into that situation came a new kind of hunter, patient, cooperative, tool-using, and able to learn from the land. For some Ice Age giants, this may have been enough to push decline further, not because one spear-ended a species, and not because every human group acted in the same way, but because survival depends on balance. When the balance is already weak, even moderate pressure can matter. What happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age may therefore include this careful truth. Humans did not enter an untouched, stable world and simply erase it. They entered a world under strain, and in some places their hunting, movement, fire, and use of space may have made recovery harder for animals already losing the conditions that once kept them strong. The human part of the Ice Age giant story becomes clearer when we stop looking for one pattern that fits every continent. The world was not one single field, and extinction did not move across it like a shadow at the same speed everywhere. In Australia, large animals had already faced major losses long before many northern Ice Age giants disappeared. In North America and South America, many large mammals vanished near the end of the Pleistocene, during a time when climate was changing and humans were also present. In Eurasia, the pattern was different again, with some animals disappearing from certain regions while related populations survived elsewhere for longer. On islands, some mammoth populations endured after their mainland relatives were gone, reminding us that isolation could sometimes preserve older worlds for a while. These differences matter. They warn us against a story that is too clean. If all the giant beasts had disappeared at the same moment, in the same way, under the same conditions, the answer might be simpler. But they did not. Some vanished earlier, some persisted in refuges, some declined where habitat changed deeply, some may have suffered more from human hunting, some were affected through the loss of prey or the collapse of older food webs. The evidence points not to one door closing everywhere at once, but to many doors narrowing in different places. This is why the question, what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, has to remain open for now. In one region, warming and changing vegetation may have weakened large herbivores first. In another, human hunting may have added the decisive pressure. In another, both may have arrived close together, making it difficult to separate one cause from the other. In another, a species may have survived the worst climatic changes, only to be trapped later in a smaller range, with fewer companions and less room to recover. The same animal could face different pressures in different places. A mammoth living on a broad mainland steppe was not in the same situation as a mammoth isolated on an island. A predator following large herds across open country was not in the same situation as one living after those herds had already thinned. A slow-breeding herbivore under light hunting pressure might continue if food and space remained strong. The same level of hunting could become dangerous if food, space, and reproduction were already weakened. This is the careful middle ground between two simple explanations. It would be too simple to say humans alone erased the Ice Age giants everywhere. It would also be too simple to say climate alone did it everywhere, and that humans did not matter. The more honest view is that extinction often comes from overlap. A species becomes vulnerable when several pressures meet. Habitat becomes smaller, food becomes less predictable, groups become isolated, young survive less often, predators lose prey, and humans enter the landscape as hunters, competitors, or sources of disturbance. None of these forces has to be overwhelming by itself. Together, they can reduce the future of a population until it no longer renews itself. For a sleep listener, this truth may feel quieter than a dramatic disaster, but it is closer to how many natural changes unfold. The giant beasts did not all fall under one sky. They faded through local histories. One valley changed before another. One herd lasted longer than another. One species found a temporary refuge while another did not. One continent lost much of its megafauna in a pattern that does not exactly match another continent's story. So the human chapter does not close the question, it deepens it. Humans were part of the late Ice Age world, and in some places their presence likely mattered greatly, but they met animals already tied to climate, plants, space, reproduction, and old ecological relationships. The disappearance of the giants was not a simple courtroom where one cause is found guilty and all others are dismissed. It was a long meeting of pressures, different in each land, and powerful because it touched the animals at the very points where large bodies are most vulnerable. Food, space, time, and the ability to begin again. The story of the giant beasts of the Ice Age is not only a story of mammoths, rhinoceroses, bison, horses, and giant sloths. It is also a story of the animals that followed them. Where large herbivores moved, large predators could live. Where herds crossed open ground, hunters watched the edges. Where an old animal weakened, where a calf fell behind, where a carcass lay in the cold, other lives gathered around that moment. The Ice Age world held predators that seem powerful even now. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, and other large carnivores and scavengers depending on the region. But they should not be imagined as monsters placed in the past to frighten us. They were animals shaped by hunger, risk, opportunity, and the bodies of the prey around them. A saber-toothed cat did not carry long canine teeth because it belonged to a fantasy. It carried them because its lineage had taken a highly specialized path in a world where large prey existed. Its heavy body, strong forelimbs, and killing method made sense only within a system that could offer animals large enough to support such specialization. A cave lion moving through cold Eurasian landscapes was not simply a larger shadow of a modern lion. It belonged to a different world of open spaces, big herbivores, harsh seasons, and ancient competition. Dire wolves in parts of the Americas lived in landscapes where large prey, pack behavior, and scavenging opportunities were tied together. Short-faced bears, depending on place and interpretation, were part of a broad predator and scavenger community where carcasses, competition, and movement across large ranges mattered. These animals were impressive, but their strength depended on what lived beneath them in the food web. This is why the predator chapter is necessary for understanding what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age. When people think of extinction, they often think first of the plant eaters. They imagine the mammoth losing grassland, the woolly rhinoceros losing steppe, the giant ground sloth losing its feeding world. But a predator can lose its world without the climate touching its body directly. It can lose its world when prey becomes rarer, when herds move differently, when carcasses become less common, when competition sharpens, or when the young cannot be fed reliably. A saber-toothed cat did not need the mammoth steppe in the same way a mammoth did. It did not graze low plants. It did not follow grasses with its mouth. But it needed the living result of those plants. Large herbivores, moving through space, vulnerable at certain moments, numerous enough across generations. If those herbivores declined, the predator's strength became less useful. Teeth do not create prey. Claws do not widen a shrinking range. Speed, power, and courage cannot replace a food web that is thinning beneath the feet. This makes the Ice Age predators strangely fragile in a way that is not obvious at first. They stood near the top of their ecosystems, but the top depends on everything below it. A large hunter needs more than sharpness. It needs enough land to search, enough prey to risk hunting, enough success to raise young, and enough balance to avoid spending more energy than it gains. When large herbivores were abundant, the system could support large predators. When herbivore populations became smaller, more scattered, or less predictable, predators felt the change through hunger. They may have followed prey into smaller refuges. They may have competed more intensely with other carnivores and with humans where their paths overlapped. They may have turned more often to scavenging or smaller prey when possible. But specialization has limits. A body built around large prey cannot easily become something entirely different. So the disappearance of the Ice Age giants was not only the silence left by missing herds, it was also the silence left by missing hunters. The old food web lost weight from below and tension from above. The great predators remind us that extinction is rarely a single line. It is a web loosening. One prey species becomes scarce. One hunter loses its main source of energy. One scavenger finds fewer remains. One valley no longer holds the same movement of life. To ask what happened to the giant beasts is therefore to ask what happened to the relationships that made giants possible on both sides of the hunt. When the large plant eaters began to thin, the predators did not simply continue as before. A food web is not a ladder where the top can remain standing after the lower steps weaken. It is more like a slow net of hunger, movement, energy, and chance. The great hunters of the Ice Age lived from the bodies of other animals, and many of those bodies were large. A saber-toothed cat did not need every animal on the plain to be a mammoth or bison, but it did need enough substantial prey to make its dangerous way of hunting worthwhile. A cave lion needed herds, young animals, weakened adults, an open country where searching could lead to food. Dire wolves and other social predators needed enough opportunities to feed groups and raise young. Large bears, whether hunting, scavenging, or feeding more broadly depending on the species and place, also depended on landscapes, rich enough to support their size. When herbivores declined, scattered, or changed their routes, predators felt the change as distance. They had to search farther. They had to spend more energy. They had to compete more sharply for the same carcasses, the same wounded animals, the same narrow chances. The loss of prey is not always sudden hunger. Sometimes it is a small worsening of every day. A hunt takes longer. A mother returns with less food. A young animal grows more slowly. An old predator takes greater risks. A territory that once supported several adults now supports fewer. In this way, the decline of large herbivores could move upward through the Ice Age world, quietly altering the lives of animals that seemed powerful from the outside. This is important for the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because the answer is not only about which species disappeared first, it is also about what each disappearance made harder for the others. If mammoths, horses, bison, ground sloths, camel relatives, or other large herbivores became less common in certain regions, the predators that used them could lose more than food. They could lose predictability. Predators survive not just by catching prey once, but by finding enough prey often enough over a lifetime. Their young need repeated feeding. Their bodies need steady energy. Their territories need to contain real opportunities, not only empty space. A saber-toothed cat's long canines and strong forequarters were impressive, but specialization can become dangerous when the world no longer offers what that specialization was shaped to meet. A cave lion could still be strong in a changing landscape, but strength does not guarantee enough prey. Dire wolves could still work together, but cooperation does not create herds where herds have become fewer. This does not mean every predator vanished only because prey declined. Climate, habitat, competition, and humans may all have affected different regions in different ways. But prey loss is one of the clearest ways to understand why the disappearance of herbivores could spread through the rest of the community. The giant plant eaters were not only animals with their own stories, they were moving stores of energy. Grass became flesh, leaves became muscle. Soil nutrients moved through dung, scavenged remains, and trampled ground. Predators, scavengers, insects, and plants all touched this cycle in different ways. When the large herbivores declined, the amount of energy moving through large bodies also changed. A carcass that never existed could not feed wolves, cats, bears, birds, beetles, or microbes. A herd that no longer passed through a valley could no longer support the same watchers along its edge. The absence of prey created other absences. This is why the Ice Age world should be imagined as a web, not a collection of isolated giants. The mammoth, the bison, the sloth, the rhinoceros, the saber-toothed cat, and the dire wolf were linked by more than danger. They were linked by energy passing through the land. When the lower part of that pattern weakened, the upper part became less secure. The great predators lost not only animals to hunt, but the ancient rhythm that made their own lives possible. The disappearance of the Ice Age predators shows that extinction is rarely only the story of one animal failing alone. It is the story of relationships becoming too thin to hold. A saber-toothed cat could vanish, but behind that disappearance stood more than the loss of one hunter. There was the changing abundance of large prey, the shifting of open habitats, the pressure on herbivore populations, and the difficulty of raising young in a world where food became less certain. A dire wolf could disappear, but behind that loss were old hunting patterns, scavenging opportunities, competition, and the movement of herds that no longer filled the land in the same way. A cave lion could fade from a region, but behind it stood changes in prey, climate, territory, and the shrinking of a world where large carnivores had once found enough room. This is why the giant beasts of the Ice Age should not be imagined as separate statues falling one after another. They were parts of a living structure. When the herbivores changed, the predators changed. When the plants changed, the herbivores changed. When the climate changed, the plants and water and ground changed. When humans entered some landscapes, another kind of pressure entered the same structure. The food web did not break like a stick in one sharp sound. It loosened like old cloth, thread by thread. One connection weakened, then another depended on it, then another felt the strain. A mammoth herd becoming smaller was not only a mammoth problem, it was a problem for the predators that watched the edges of the herd, for scavengers that used the remains, for plants affected by grazing and trampling, and for the soil that received nutrients through movement and dung. A giant ground sloth disappearing from a place was not only the absence of a slow, heavy browser, it was also the loss of a body that shaped vegetation in its own way. A bison herd changing its route was not only movement on a map, it was the movement of food, danger, fertility, and memory across the land. The Ice Age giants were tied together by ordinary needs, but ordinary needs are the strongest ties in nature. Hunger ties a predator to prey. Plants tie an herbivore to climate. Movement ties a herd to rivers, valleys, and open ground. Reproduction ties the present to the future. When those ties begin to fail, the world may still look alive, but it is no longer the same world. This helps us understand why the loss of the great predators feels so meaningful. Predators are often remembered for their weapons: teeth, claws, jaws, strength, speed. But the real foundation of a predator is not its weapon. It is the living system that gives the weapon a purpose. A saber-toothed cat's teeth were meaningful only where large prey existed often enough. A dire wolf's pack behavior was meaningful only where group hunting and scavenging could bring enough food. A cave lion's power was meaningful only where territory still held the energy needed to support it. When the lower layers of the system weakened, the top became exposed. The old hunters lost more than prey. They lost the world that had made their bodies useful. This does not mean every predator vanished because of one direct chain from one lost herbivore. Nature is less tidy than that. Some predators could shift prey, some could scavenge, some could move. Some may have survived longer in one region than another, but large predators like large herbivores carried large needs. They needed space, repeated success, and enough time to raise young. When the Ice Age world became more fragmented, more human-influenced in some places, and less rich in large herbivores in many regions, those needs became harder to meet. The disappearance of the predators therefore deepens the central question of the video. What happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age was not only that certain animals died out. What happened was that an ancient way of connecting life began to disappear. The grassland, the herd, the hunt, the carcass, the scavenger, the path, the calf, the old predator following from a distance, all of these belong to one rhythm. When that rhythm weakened, the giants lost not only their numbers, they lost the relationships that had once made their world whole. Not every giant disappeared in the same way, and not every land told the same ending. This is one of the most important truths in the story of the Ice Age beasts. If we look only at one continent, one famous animal, or one dramatic moment, we may think the answer is simple. But when we step back and look across the wider world, the pattern becomes more uneven. North America lost many of its large mammals near the end of the Pleistocene. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and other large animals disappeared from landscapes where they had once played major roles. South America also lost many remarkable giants, including huge ground sloths, glyptodonts, large native ungulates, and powerful predators. Australia had already seen the loss of many large animals earlier, including giant marsupials and large reptiles, in a pattern that remains widely discussed because climate, fire, and human arrival all have to be considered carefully. Eurasia had its own mixed story. Some animals vanished from certain regions, while other large mammals survived longer or persisted in related forms. Africa was different again, because many large mammals survived there into the present, though not unchanged and not untouched by human history. These differences matter because they prevent us from turning the disappearance of the Ice Age giants into one clean sentence. The Earth did not lose its giants as if a single bell rang across every continent. The losses came in waves, patches, delays, and local endings. A mammoth in Siberia did not live the same story as a mastodon in North America. A giant ground sloth in South America did not face the exact same landscape as a woolly rhinoceros in northern Eurasia. A large marsupial in ancient Australia belonged to a different evolutionary world from a saber-toothed cat in the Americas. Their bodies were different, their foods were different, their predators and competitors were different, and the timing of human presence and climate change was not identical. To ask what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, We must therefore ask a more careful question. What happened in each place, to each kind of giant, under each combination of pressures? In some regions, warming and shifting vegetation may have reduced the open habitats that large grazers needed. In others, drying, fire, or changing water may have altered the land in different ways. In some places, human hunting may have arrived when animal populations were already stressed. In other places, human impact may have been stronger, weaker, earlier, later, or harder to detect. The same broad forces appear again and again, but they do not appear in the same order everywhere. This is why regional comparison is not a distraction from the title. It is one of the safest ways to answer it honestly. The giant beasts of the Ice Age did not all vanish because one thing happened once. They vanished because different living worlds became less able to support them. On large continents, habitats could shift across huge distances, but movement was still limited by mountains, ice, rivers, deserts, forests, wetlands, and later by human presence. On islands, the story could be even more delicate. Isolation might protect a small population for a while by keeping it away from some pressures, but it could also trap it inside a narrow world. A population that survives on an island may appear lucky because it has escaped the mainland collapse. Yet it may also be vulnerable because it has less room, fewer companions, fewer routes, and fewer ways to recover from drought, disease, storms, food shortage, or sudden disturbance. This unevenness gives the Ice Age story its quiet depth. There was no single last day for all giants. There were many last days, separated by land, species, climate, and chance. One place lost its large grazers while another still held them. One predator vanished after its prey declined. One herbivore survived in a refuge after its relatives elsewhere were gone. One ecosystem changed quickly, another slowly. The answer to what happened then is not a straight line. It is a map of different endings, all connected by the same deeper lesson. A giant can seem permanent in one world and become fragile in another. Some Ice Age giants disappeared early. Others lingered like echoes of an older world. This difference in timing is one of the strongest reasons we should be careful with the word extinction. It can sound like a single event, a moment when a species simply ends. But for many giant animals, extinction was more like a long retreat across a map. A species could disappear from one region while surviving in another. A mainland population could vanish while an isolated island population continued. One animal could be gone from the open plains, yet still remain in a refuge where enough of the old conditions survived. The woolly mammoth gives one of the clearest examples. Across much of its former range, mammoths declined and disappeared. As the last ice age ended, open habitats changed, climates shifted, and humans became part of more northern landscapes. Yet some mammoths survived long after most people imagined them gone. On remote Arctic islands, especially Wrangel Island, small populations lasted thousands of years beyond the mainland decline. These mammoths were not living in the great wide mammoth steppe of earlier times. They were survivors in a narrowed world. Their story reminds us that the end of the giants was not a curtain dropping everywhere at once. It was more like a light fading unevenly, with a few dim points remaining after the broad glow had passed. An island can protect, but it can also confine. A population isolated from mainland dangers may avoid some predators, some competitors, and perhaps some human pressure for a time. But isolation comes with its own cost. The animals have less room. They have fewer places to go if food fails. They have fewer other groups to join if numbers decline. Their genetic world becomes smaller. Their future depends more heavily on local weather, fresh water, storms, disease, and chance. A mainland herd may follow shifting habitats across great distances if routes remain open. An island population cannot simply walk beyond the sea. So, when we think about the last mammoths on islands, we should not imagine a perfect refuge. We should imagine a small pocket of survival, precious because it lasted, fragile because it was limited. This same idea applies beyond mammoths. Some large animals vanished from one region while close relatives survived elsewhere. Some forms of bison, horses, elephants, rhinoceroses, or big cats had different fates depending on geography, habitat, and human history. The Ice Age did not remove all large animals from the earth. Elephants, rhinoceroses, bison, lions, bears, horses, and other large mammals still exist in some form today, though often in different places, smaller ranges, or under heavy human pressure. This survival matters because it shows that largeness itself was not a simple death sentence. Many large animals continued where conditions, adaptation, range, behavior, and chance allowed them to continue. The question is not why every large animal had to disappear, because they did not. The question is why so many particular Ice Age giants lost the worlds that had supported them. A giant ground sloth in the Americas faced one set of landscapes and human timelines. A woolly rhinoceros in northern Eurasia faced another. A mammoth on a remote island faced a different problem again. Not a vast continent changing beneath its feet, but a small enclosed world where one severe event could matter greatly. This uneven timing keeps the story honest. It tells us that the disappearance of the giant beasts was not a single clean mechanism repeating everywhere. If climate alone were the same simple answer everywhere, we would expect the pattern to be more uniform. If human hunting alone were the same simple answer everywhere, we would also expect the timing and survival of island populations to be easier to explain. Instead, the evidence gives us a more complicated truth. Some giants were lost as habitats changed. Some may have been pushed harder by people. Some survived in refuges until their refuges also failed. Some predators followed the decline of prey. Some populations may have been so small that chance itself became dangerous. Extinction, in this view, is not only a cause, it is a condition reached when a population has too few safe options left. The last giants were not always the weakest. Sometimes they were simply the ones left in the last places where the old world still held together for a little longer. Their survival does not solve the mystery, it deepens it. It asks us to see extinction not as one ending, but as many endings spread across time. The uneven ending of the Ice Age giants is what keeps the story from becoming too simple. If every giant animal had disappeared at the same time, under the same sky, in the same kind of landscape, we might be able to point to one cause and leave the question there. But the world does not give us such a clean answer. Some animals vanished on continents while others remained for thousands of years in colder refuges. Some disappeared from open grasslands, while relatives or similar large animals survived in different environments. Some losses happened where climate change was clearly reshaping the land. Some happened where humans were present and capable of hunting large animals. Some happened where both forces overlapped so closely that separating them becomes difficult. This unevenness does not weaken the story. It makes the story more honest. It tells us that what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age was not a single strike, but a set of pressures meeting different lives in different places. A mammoth on a mainland plain, a mastodon in a wooded landscape, a giant ground sloth in the Americas, a woolly rhinoceros in Eurasia, and a large predator following herds were not all facing the exact same world. Their food was different. Their movement was different. Their enemies were different. Their contact with humans was different. Their ability to shift range was different. Even within one species, one population could be stronger than another simply because it lived in a place where the old conditions remained longer. This is why a careful answer must avoid two mistakes. The first mistake is to say that climate alone explains everything. Climate and habitat change were powerful, but if they were the only force in the same way everywhere, the pattern would be easier to predict. The second mistake is to say that humans alone explain everything. Human hunting and disturbance likely mattered in many places, but human arrival did not unfold identically across all lands, and some populations survived after others were gone. The safer answer is slower. It says that extinction often happens when pressures overlap. A changing climate may reduce the right habitat. A smaller habitat may weaken herds. Weaker herds may reproduce more slowly or become isolated. Humans may add hunting pressure or disturbance. Predators may lose prey. A small population may then become vulnerable to drought, disease, harsh winters, or simple chance. No one pressure needs to be the only cause. The danger comes from the meeting. The giant beasts were especially exposed to this kind of meeting because they needed so much from the world. They needed space. They needed enough food across seasons. They needed time for young animals to grow. They needed roots between groups. They needed ecosystems that still rewarded the size and habits they carried. When those needs were met, they could seem permanent. When several needs were weakened at once, even a strong animal could lose its future. This is the deeper meaning of the different extinction timings. They show us that extinction is not always a single event. It can be a threshold reached by different paths. One species reaches it through habitat loss, another through hunting added to slow reproduction, another through prey decline, another through isolation, another through a small refuge that lasts for a while, then fails. From far away, all these endings look like one word: vanished. Up close, they are many histories. So, when we ask what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, the answer cannot be shouted. It has to be held carefully. The giants disappeared because many of the worlds that supported them changed beyond what their bodies, populations, and relationships could continue to bear. Not everywhere at once. Not for one simple reason. Not always quickly. Their disappearance was a map of different endings, written across climate, land, food, human presence, and time. When the giant beasts of the Ice Age disappeared, the world did not only lose large bodies, it lost large forces moving through the land. A mammoth was not only an animal eating grass beneath a cold sky, it was also a weight pressing into snow and soil, a mouth cutting vegetation, a body carrying nutrients from one place to another, a herd opening paths across wide country. A giant ground sloth was not only a slow browser, it was a powerful feeder that could reach, pull, break, and shape plants in ways smaller animals could not. A woolly rhinoceros was not only a survivor of cold steppe, it was a grazer whose body helped keep certain open landscapes in motion. These animals lived from the land, but they also acted upon it. This is one of the quietest meanings behind the question: what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age? Their disappearance was not only the absence of mammoths, sloths, rhinoceroses, bison, horses, predators, and scavengers. It was the absence of the work they had been doing without intention. Large herbivores can change vegetation simply by feeding. When they graze, they reduce some plants and give others room. When they browse, they break branches, limit young trees, open gaps, and alter the height and density of growth. When they walk, they trample seedlings, disturb soil, press snow, and create paths. When they defecate, they return nutrients to the ground in different places from where they fed. When they die, their bodies feed scavengers, insects, microbes, and soil. None of this is dramatic in one moment, but over generations it can shape a landscape. The Ice Age giants were part of this slow shaping. A herd crossing a plain was not just moving through an ecosystem, it was helping make the ecosystem what it was. This matters because many of the vanished giants were connected to open environments. Their feeding and movement may have helped maintain some open patches by limiting woody growth and cycling nutrients across space. Climate and soil were still deeply important. Animals did not control everything, but animals were not passive decorations. A cold grassland with mammoths, horses, bison, and rhinoceroses was not the same living system as a cold grassland without them. The pressure of teeth and feet changed how plants grew. The movement of herds changed how nutrients traveled. The presence of large prey changed where predators moved and where carcasses appeared. Even the smallest creatures could be affected because dung, disturbed ground, and dead bodies create opportunities for insects, birds, scavengers, plants, and microbes. In this way, A giant body becomes many smaller lives spread across the land. When the giants vanished, these connections weakened. A valley without large grazers might slowly grow denser with shrubs or young trees if climate allowed it. A plain without heavy trampling might hold snow, soil, and vegetation differently. A plant whose seeds once moved in the gut or fur of a large animal might lose part of its old journey. A predator or scavenger might find fewer remains. The change did not need to happen everywhere in the same way. Different ecosystems responded differently, but the larger lesson remains. Extinction removes behavior as well as bodies. It removes feeding, walking, breaking, carrying, digging, trampling, and dying in particular places. The Ice Age giants were not only things the world contained, they were processes the world used. Their absence changed the rhythm of landscapes that had once been shaped by their presence. To ask what happened to them is therefore also to ask what happened after them, when the land continued, but without the heavy steps that had helped write its older pattern. After the giant beasts faded from many Ice Age landscapes, the land did not become empty. Life continued, but it continued with a different weight missing from it. Grasses still grew, shrubs still spread, trees still rooted where climate allowed them. Rivers still moved across valleys, and smaller animals still made their burrows, nests, trails, and feeding places. But the old pressure of great bodies was no longer the same. Without large grazers and browsers moving across the ground, some places may have changed in structure. Young trees and shrubs could grow more densely where heavy feeding had once held them back. Open patches could close more easily if climate and moisture favored woody plants. Paths once kept clear by repeated movement could fade into ordinary ground. Soil that had been pressed, broken, mixed, and fertilized by large animals would receive a different kind of disturbance. The land was still alive, but it no longer carried the same rhythm of heavy steps. This matters for the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, because their disappearance did not end with their own bodies. It continued outward into the places they had shaped. A mammoth herd crossing a plain could disturb snow cover, expose vegetation, knock down shrubs, spread dung, and move nutrients across distance. Without that herd, snow might lie differently, plants might compete differently, and nutrients might stay closer to where smaller animals placed them. A giant ground sloth feeding on vegetation could open space in ways a small browser could not. Without such large browsers, some plants may have faced less breaking, less stripping, and less movement of seeds. A large grazer turning grass into flesh and dung was part of a cycle that linked plants, soil, insects, scavengers, and predators. Once the animal was gone, that cycle did not stop completely, but it changed scale. Fire may also have changed in some landscapes, though never in one simple way everywhere. Large herbivores can reduce plant material by eating and trampling it. In certain ecosystems, fewer large grazers may allow more vegetation to build up, which can influence how fires behave if the climate is dry enough and ignition occurs. In other places, wetter conditions, forests, or different plant communities may have changed fire patterns in other directions. The important point is not that the loss of giants created one universal fire story. The important point is that large animals had once been part of how fuel, plants, and open ground were balanced. Remove them, and the balance could shift. Smaller animals felt the change too, even if they did not know its cause. Birds that used open ground might find different cover. Insects that depended on dung from large herbivores might lose a major resource. Scavengers might find fewer enormous carcasses. Predators that could not follow smaller prey as effectively might decline or change their behavior. Plants that once benefited from being carried, disturbed, or cleared by large bodies might lose part of their old opportunity. Other species may have benefited from the new conditions. Shrubs could expand. Forest animals could move into places that became more wooded. Smaller herbivores could use habitats left behind by larger ones. Extinction rarely leaves only loss in a simple sense. It leaves rearrangement. Some forms of life decline, others expand. But the old world, the one built around the movement of giants, becomes harder to recognize. This is one of the quiet educational lessons hidden inside the Ice Age story. An animal is not only a creature with a name, it is also a set of actions repeated over time. Eating is an action, walking is an action. Breaking branches, spreading seeds, opening paths, feeding predators, leaving bones, and returning nutrients are all actions. When a species disappears, those actions disappear with it, unless another species can partly replace them. The giant beasts of the Ice Age had performed large actions. Their absence therefore left large spaces, not always empty spaces, but changed spaces. The land after them was not dead, it was different. And in that difference, we can see that extinction is not only the end of a life form, it is the removal of a way the world once worked. The loss of the giant beasts teaches us that extinction is never only the disappearance of a name from the earth. It is not only the end of mammoth, mastodon, giant ground sloth, woolly rhinoceros, saber-toothed cat, dire wolf, or cave lion. It is the loss of a role, a pressure, a movement, and a relationship. When a large animal vanishes, the world does not simply remove one shape from the landscape and continue unchanged. Something that animal did every day is also removed. The mammoth no longer opens paths through snow. The giant sloth no longer pulls branches down with slow strength. The rhinoceros no longer grazes across cold open ground. The large predator no longer follows the herds at the edge of danger. The scavengers no longer gather around the same kind of enormous carcass. The soil no longer receives the same pattern of dung, trampling, and disturbance. The plants no longer meet the same mouths. This is why the disappearance of the Ice Age giants has value beyond curiosity. It helps us understand that living systems are held together by repeated actions. A forest is not only trees, a grassland is not only grass, a river valley is not only water and stone. Each place is shaped by the animals that feed there, move there, die there, and return nutrients there. The Ice Age giants were part of the old machinery of the living world, though they did not know it. They were not trying to maintain ecosystems. They were only living. Yet by living, they helped create the conditions around them. This is a quiet lesson, and it should not be turned into fear. It does not mean that every change destroys the earth. Nature has always changed. Species have always appeared, shifted, and disappeared across deep time. But the story of the Ice Age giants reminds us that when large animals vanish quickly, the effects can move outward in ways that are difficult to see at first. A missing herbivore may become a changing plant community. A changing plant community may become a different fire pattern, a different soil surface, a different shelter for smaller animals. A missing prey animal may become a missing predator. A missing predator may change how other animals feed, hide, or move. The first absence creates other absences, and also new openings. Some species benefit, some decline. The world continues, but not as the same world. That is the educational value at the heart of this part of the story. Extinction is not only about pity for the last animal, it is about understanding connection. The giant beasts of the Ice Age were powerful, but their power was never isolated. They depended on climate, food, space, reproduction, and time. In return, other forms of life depended on them. Their disappearance shows how even the strongest bodies are part of wider systems. A creature can be huge and still be held by delicate relationships. A landscape can look solid and still depend on movement that happens quietly every day. A world can change, long before anyone names the change. When we look back at the bones of the giant beasts, we are not only looking at death, we are looking at evidence of a former way of life, a way in which grass became herds, herds became prey, prey became predators, bodies became soil, and movement became landscape. The Ice Age giants remind us that no species stands alone in the story of life. Every animal is also a thread. When enough threads are pulled away, the pattern does not vanish at once, but it becomes something else. And this understanding prepares us to return to the central question with more care. Not only what made the giants disappear, but what kind of world disappeared with them. When we come back to the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age, we should come back more slowly than when we began. At first, it is easy to imagine a simple answer. The climate warmed, the ice retreated, humans hunted, the animals vanished. But the deeper story does not fit neatly into one sentence. The giant beasts were not standing outside the world waiting for one force to strike them down. They were living inside a web of climate, plants, water, migration, birth, hunger, predators, and eventually human presence. A woolly mammoth was not only a cold-adapted animal, it was part of open grasslands, seasonal roots, herd memory, calf survival, and the slow turning of generations. A giant ground sloth was not only a large browser, it was part of vegetation, forest edges, open spaces, and the strength of a body built for a different kind of landscape. A saber-toothed cat was not only a predator with long teeth, it was tied to the presence of large prey, to the movement of herbivores, and to a food web that could still support specialized hunters. What happened to them was therefore not simply death, it was the weakening of the worlds that made their bodies meaningful. As the last ice age moved toward its end, many landscapes changed. In some regions, cold, dry steppe became smaller, wetter, more wooded, or more broken. The mammoth steppe, once broad enough to support many large grazers, faded unevenly. Food did not vanish from the earth, but the right food in the right places became less dependable for some giant animals. Routes that once connected feeding grounds could become less useful. Herds could become smaller, groups could become isolated. Young animals could have a harder time surviving long enough to replace the old. At the same time, the cost of being large remained. Large bodies needed much food. Large animals often reproduced slowly. Large predators needed enough prey across enough space. Their strength was real, but strength does not remove hunger, restore habitat, or speed up reproduction. Then humans entered many of these changing worlds. They were not a single simple cause everywhere, and they did not arrive in all regions at the same moment. But they were a real force. They hunted in some places, they used fire in some landscapes, they moved along rivers, valleys, crossings, and open routes that animals also used. Where animal populations were already stressed by habitat change and slow recovery, even added pressure that seemed moderate could matter over generations. This is why a careful answer must hold several truths at once. Climate mattered, habitat mattered, body size mattered, reproduction mattered, predators and prey mattered. Human activity mattered in some places, perhaps very strongly, but not in the exact same way everywhere. The giant beasts did not disappear as one single crowd. They disappeared through different local histories. Some vanished earlier, some lingered longer, some survived in refuges. Some island mammoths remained long after mainland populations were gone. These differences do not make the mystery weaker, they make it more honest. What happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age was a meeting of pressures, each one touching a different part of survival. The land changed what it could provide. The animals carried bodies shaped for older conditions. Their young needed time, their herds needed connection, their predators needed prey, and humans, where they overlapped with them, added another layer to an already narrowing future. The giants were not failures. They were successful animals whose worlds slowly stopped fitting around them. The educational lesson left by the giant beasts of the Ice Age is not that strength is meaningless. Strength mattered deeply. A mammoth's body helped it survive cold that would break many smaller creatures. A woolly rhinoceros carried power across open ground. A giant sloth used its size and limbs to feed in ways no small animal could copy. A saber-toothed cat, a cave lion, or a dire wolf belonged to a world where hunting, scavenging, and risk were part of the balance of life. These animals were not weak. They were not poorly made. They were some of the most impressive living answers their environments had ever produced, but their story teaches something quieter than power. It teaches that no living thing, however strong, survives alone. Every body depends on a world around it. Food must grow somewhere. Water must remain reachable. Young must survive long enough to continue the population. Groups must stay connected enough to breed. Predators must find prey. Prey must find plants. Plants must answer climate, soil, moisture, and season. A creature may seem independent because we see only the body, but beneath the body is a web of support. When that web changes too much, strength can become stranded. This is one of the most useful truths we can take from the disappearance of the Ice Age giants. The mammoth was strong, but it still needed open habitat and enough vegetation. The saber-toothed cat was dangerous, but it still needed prey. The giant ground sloth was powerful, but it still needed a landscape where its slow life could continue. Their size did not free them from dependence. It made their dependence larger. More food, more space, more time, more connection. In a stable world, those needs could be met. In a changing world, those needs became harder to protect. This lesson is not only about the past, it helps us understand life more honestly in the present. Ecosystems are not collections of separate objects. They are relationships repeated over time. A grassland is shaped by the animals that eat it, the fires that pass through it, the rain that feeds it, the soil that holds it, and the movement of herds across it. A forest is shaped by seeds, shade, insects, birds, mammals, fungi, water, and decay. A species is not only a name in a book, it is a way of moving energy through the world. When a species disappears, the world loses more than a form. It loses a behavior, a pressure, a pattern, and sometimes a memory written into the land itself. The Ice Age giants remind us to look beyond the dramatic image of extinction and notice the slower truth. A living world can weaken before it looks broken. A population can decline before the last individual appears. A habitat can narrow before it disappears. A food web can thin before it collapses. This is why careful knowledge matters. If we reduce the past to one simple cause, we miss the real warning. The warning is not that one change always destroys everything. Nature has always changed. The warning is that several pressures, arriving together, can make recovery difficult even for strong species. Climate change, habitat loss, slow reproduction, hunting pressure, isolation, and broken food webs can overlap. Each one may be survivable alone. Together, they can close the future. The value of studying the giant beasts is that it teaches humility. We learn that power is never absolute. We learn that survival depends on fit, not just force. We learn that the largest animals can be deeply vulnerable when the world around them no longer supports the life their bodies were built to live. And perhaps most importantly, we learn to see living systems with more patience. The past does not give us a simple answer to carry like a stone. It gives us a slower understanding. Every species is part of a wider home, and when that home changes too deeply, even giants may have nowhere left to stand. When the giant beasts of the Ice Age vanished, they did not take the earth with them. The rivers still moved, the seasons still turned, grass still returned after winter, forests spread where climate allowed them. Smaller animals continue to feed, hide, breed, and move through the spaces left behind. Life did not stop, but it was no longer the same life. A world that had once held mammoths on cold plains, giant sloths among ancient vegetation, woolly rhinoceroses in open steppe, and saber-toothed cats near the edge of large herds had quietly become another world. The change was not only written in bones, it was written in missing footsteps, missing grazing pressure, missing migration paths, missing predators, and missing relationships between animals and land. This is why the question of what happened to the giant beasts of the Ice Age cannot be answered only by saying that they went extinct. Extinction names the ending, but it does not fully describe the loss. What disappeared was a way of living that had taken shape over deep time. The giants had belonged to a planet with different climates, different open spaces, different food webs, and different balances of risk and survival. They had survived cold, hunger, injury, competition, and ordinary death for thousands of generations. They were not weak animals. They were not mistakes. They were powerful lives carried by a world that once fit them. Then that fit became harder to maintain. The climate shifted. Some habitats narrowed. Food became less predictable in many regions. Slow reproduction made recovery difficult. Predators lost the old abundance of prey. Human beings entered some landscapes as hunters, fire users, travelers, and careful observers of animal movement. None of these forces needs to be treated as the only answer everywhere. The more honest answer is quieter. Many pressures met, and the future of many giants became too narrow to continue. Still, their story should not leave only sadness. It should leave understanding. The bones of mammoths and sloths are not just remains of failure. They are records of former success. They show that life can become beautifully adapted to one world and still be vulnerable when that world changes. They remind us that survival is not the same as strength alone. Survival is a relationship between a body and its surroundings. A species needs more than power. It needs enough food, enough space, enough young, enough time, and enough connection to begin again after hard seasons. When those supports weaken together, even the largest animals can become fragile. This is the value of looking back at the Ice Age giants before sleep. Not to fear the past, not to blame one cause too quickly, not to turn ancient animals into legends, but to notice how quietly a living world can change. A herd can grow smaller before anyone sees the end. A predator can lose its future before its teeth lose their sharpness. A landscape can keep breathing while becoming less able to hold the lives it once held. The giant beasts leave behind a slow lesson. Every creature is more than itself. It is part of a place, a pattern, and a chain of dependence older than memory. The mammoth was grassland, weather, herd, calf, tusk, hunger, and path. The saber-toothed cat was prey, shadow, risk, strength, and need. The giant sloth was vegetation, reach, patience, and ground. Their lives were woven into the earth, and when they vanished, the weave changed. So perhaps the final thing to carry from this story is not a perfect answer, but a more careful way of seeing. The Ice Age giants ask us to look at life as connection, not as isolated strength. They ask us to understand that a world can make room for giants, and later, through many small changes, stop making room for them. And when we stand in the quiet after their passing, looking at bones, footprints, frozen remains, and empty spaces where great herds once moved, what are we really seeing? The end of an ancient world, or a reminder that every living world is held together more gently than it appears?